I made a video on this topic a couple of years ago, and Eleanor uh, edited it extremely well, so I'm not going to be able to do it any better than that. So we'll have a discussion afterwards.
A Primer on the Knightly Virtues, a Flamma Scholaris production. This class examines the knightly virtues, their history, and their application by the modern medievalist. It is based upon the research of Sir Jaime von Atzinger, KSCA, modernly known as Jamie Haley.
As I was coming up and being trained in the knightly arts, I had many conversations with people, with knights, with people who had historical knowledge about the knightly virtues. And I found that there were lots of different lists. Some people had 8 virtues, some people had 9 virtues. A lot of people said 7. And I always wondered, why is it that we don't have a list that's codified? If this is such a popular concept, how is it so varied across so many people and contexts? So I started to look into it. I found that there are 7 because Raymond Lull said that there were 7. Raymond Lull was a 13th century nobleman born in Spain. In his early life, he wrote about war and horses. If he wasn't a knight in title, we know that he was at least familiar with the warrior class of the time. Later in his life, he had a religious awakening, became a hermit, and started writing books on theology, and became a very important Catholic scholar. One of the smaller works that he wrote towards the end of his life was called The Book of the Order of Chivalry. And in that book, he sets out the duties of the knight, the best way to train, and he devotes a section to the knightly virtues. The virtues he chooses are fortitude, justice, mercy, charity, faith, prudence, and hope. Looking into it, I wondered why did he choose those? And after a little bit of study, it became pretty clear. He lifted them whole cloth from Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is perhaps the most influential medieval theologian. He wrote Summa Theologica, which is a long work that reinvented Catholic theology in an effort to win over non-believers. As part of that, he wrote about the virtues. He talked about the 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues. The 4 cardinal virtues were fortitude, justice, mercy, and prudence, and the theological virtues were faith, hope, and charity. Aquinas' work on the virtues wasn't directed at the knightly class at all. It was directed at everyday people, how to be better, and specifically how to be better Christians. On a side note, Aquinas himself took his 4 cardinal virtues from Aristotle, who was an ancient Greek philosopher who more or less invented virtue ethics. Since the classic 7 virtues were not really knightly virtues, I feel like I have some leeway to make my own list, like a lot of the modern people do. I took 8 virtues that were common to many of the modern lists and that resonate with me. What I'll be doing here is I'll be defining them, I'll be talking about how they relate to the ancient lists and how they relate to the modern Middle Ages.
If you're interested about more modern views on the virtues, check out Sir Vitus's work, The 7 Virtues, Sir Garrick's essay of the virtues that pertain to chivalry, and websites such as Chiv Today or Modern Chivalry.
The first virtue I'll talk about is prowess. There are many kinds of prowess. Prowess really just means skill, but when you're talking about the warrior class, knighthood specifically, it always means how well you can overcome your opponent's skill at arms. In period, prowess was the profession. It was the reason that the class existed. They were professional soldiers. Their use to their liege lord was their skill in battle. In the modern Middle Ages, it's the bar of entry into the order of knighthood. You can argue whether it's the most important virtue, whether it's not the most important virtue, but to talk about a knight who has never been a good fighter is kind of like talking about an Olympian who's never been good at a sport. It doesn't really jive. That said, once you're knighted, you can never win another fight again, and you can still be a good knight, so it's not the only important virtue, clearly. The next virtue we're going to look at is courage, which is a response to fear. In period, the fear of death and how you interact with that is really what they mean when they talk about courage. Being able to go into battle, go into danger, and do your job as a soldier, despite the fact that you might be killed for it, is really one of the core tenets of being a good soldier, being a good knight. In the modern context, we don't really risk death. We barely even risk injury, but what we risk is renown. In our society, the coin of the realm is renown, it's often said. And what that means is that when you're doing neat things, people talk about it. And that's really good when the things go well, and it can be less pleasant when things go bad. And what we're risking is attempting something new, attempting something great, and having it fail on us. And this is actually a fairly period experience. So one of the interesting things about the medieval mindset was that the risking was almost more valuable than the succeeding. So there are lots of stories of knights who travel to foreign lands and challenge people to jousts or duels. And whether they win or lost the duel is almost inconsequential to the story. What's important is they put themselves on the line, they put their lives, they put their renown on the line, and that's what made them heroes, not even so much how they did in the moment. Next, we'll talk about justice, which is our behavior in situations that should be fair. In period, the knightly class were often landholders. They were called upon to be regional judges. They were tasked with keeping the peace. They were the king's arm of justice. That you can think of them as almost the police class of the Middle Ages. They were beholden to the laws, but only loosely a lot of times. Much like today, it had a lot to do with who you knew, who you were, and how much influence you had on the crown. In the modern Middle Ages, the knights are, again, often the tool that the crown uses to solve problems. They're looked at as role models, and for better or worse, they're often held to a higher standard of behavior. Next, we'll move to mercy, which is restraining the use of power or violence. In period, the knightly class grew out of the warrior class. They were first horsemen, and only later was religion introduced, and where they codified into a social order with some protections and some restrictions. The church commanded them to be protectors of the weak and of the faithful, although by the number of times that they had to pass laws and prescriptions on behavior, it's likely that that was a tough sell. In books of history, we have the truce of God and the peace of God, both of which were prescriptions about when you could engage in warfare, who was a valid target for violence, who should be protected, and who the enemy, in air quotes, could be. In modern times, Duke Ullard talks about the knight's mercy, and this is the idea that in battle, if a knight sees that the opponent is at a disadvantage or that there's some weakness in the other side, the merciful thing to do is to end the fight in the most efficient way possible. It's mercy through the efficient execution of your prowess. Out of harness, mercy looks more like an acknowledgement of and a reticence to use the social advantages that renown brings. Being important in the society really insulates you from a lot of responsibility and sometimes from public backlash. And being merciful in that is knowing this and not using that to your advantage. Next, we'll talk about loyalty, or giving up your personal power to another person or an idea. In period, feudalism is really a system of codified relationships between powerful people, and loyalty was at its heart. It tied people into groups, it defined their roles, and it was often very messy. People had to navigate multiple layers of loyalty, and there were often conflicts. Interestingly, for the medieval person, loyalty was often to a particular person rather than a kingdom or a side. So, for instance, you would have ties to your cousin who might be part of a faction that was warring for influence or territory with your liege lord, and you'd have to decide which one of those loyalties was most primary. In the modern times, it can be just as messy. We have family, friends, households, baronies, dependents, crowns, and official positions that all demand our time and our energy as upkeep. And navigating those can be really challenging, but it can also be part of the fun of being in the modern Middle Ages. Sir Vitus, in his work on the virtues, talks about loyalty as being our faith. And he says that service is the highest expression of that faith. It's really what ties the society together. Now let's move to generosity, giving up of personal wealth to another person. In period, there's an idea of noblesse oblige, which is the obligation of nobility. It was believed that so much was given to great men and women so that they could give back and distribute it to those who deserved it. One of the main roles of a leader was to reward loyalty and courage, and this did two things. It kept retainers happy and motivated, and it was also an important sign of wealth. Extravagant public celebrations and extravagant giving was a way to show pride in your group and also to show off how well off you were. In modern times, we're not a group that generates an income from this. We don't necessarily have money to give to those people that we find courageous or loyal. What we can do is give in materials and time. Often our acts of service and our acts of training and help are our generosity. Now let's discuss courtesy, or following the rules of good behavior. By the time knightly virtues were codified, knights were as much courtiers as they were soldiers. The most generous patrons were the ones who held courts, and as the knights were considered the lowest rung of nobility, they had all the social etiquette that entailed. In combat, when we talk about courtesy and knights, we often conflate that with chivalry as a code, and there's this interesting interplay between what is courteous and what is allowed. Much of the complexity arises from the chaotic nature of loyalty and combat in the Middle Ages. The person at the tip of your sword today might well be the one who's guarding your camp tomorrow. In the modern time, knights and peers in general are held up as role models, and in fact respect is written into many of the vows that we take when we become peers. Now, which rules to follow to remain courteous is always an ongoing discussion. Finally, let's talk about franchise, or fulfilling the role of the knight. This is perhaps the least understood of all of the knightly virtues. In period, knighthood was a social class with expectations, privileges, and customs like any other. You can also think about franchise in period as a blending and a constant evocation of the knightly virtues as a whole. This is very much like prudence was for Aristotle. It's the distillation of the virtues into a lifestyle rather than a concept. In the modern Middle Ages, I think of franchise as if a stranger were to walk out into a society event, would they be able to pick out the knights without knowing anything about the trappings of the office? And this can cover things like appearance, bearing, confidence, skill level, a willingness to engage people and affect change in the society around. It's important to note that you can exhibit franchise without having the title of a knight. You can live these virtues in lots of different ways. Given the theological origins of the knightly virtues, it's fair to say that they are less knightly virtues than they are universal to all people of every station. The concept that there are particular virtues that a perfect knight should possess is as old as the concept of knighthood itself. My hope is that when a squire is asked to recite the virtues, when knights are adorning the regalia, and when people write speeches on chivalry, those of us who walk the path will understand a little better that any such list is abstracted, abbreviated, and subjective. Perhaps the list should be more personally meaningful, made up of those virtues we hold most dear and those that we find the hardest to follow.
All right, so that was a long list of stuff, and I want to have a couple caveats there. One, I've been called out a couple times for saying franchise instead of franchise. It's franchise if you're French. My persona is not French, so I prefer franchise. And two, I think it's impossible to talk about chivalry and not talk about Catholicism, but that's hard to translate into a modern context. So those two caveats aside, I'm going to open it up to questions and discussion. So Aveline says, where can we find more information about the Truce of God? That was a papal edict or a series of papal edicts. Wikipedia will give you a really good rundown.
Cool, thank you. I'll look it up.
For more information, it had to do with essentially rules of combat. We would call them rules of engagement now, and when it was okay to use force.
And upon whom?
Right. So Eleanor says, unmute if you want to ask questions.
Hey, Jamie. I noticed that the partway through, and I didn't catch it at the beginning, that you were equating each of the virtues to a line from the Mid-Realm Chivalry Oath. Do you have like a handout or something to see that? I'd kind of like to see how you correlate them all a little bit more.
I don't, but I could absolutely go back through the video and give you the kind of blow by blow if you'd like. That was
Sure, or if you put a link to the video in the comments, that might be helpful too.
I can do that. For those who would like more information, I also have a more in-depth paper on the historical background of the virtues. We'll link that in the comments as well.
So you talked about how some of the virtues tie into Catholicism, and I know that you're trying to balance this as a secular discussion, but without proselytizing too much, can you give us some more information about how you feel it ties in and what some of the most important tenets would be when relating it to Catholicism or Christianity?
Sure, absolutely. I think that, and this is definitely my own scholarship talking, that knighthood and the virtues specifically were almost Catholic propaganda more than they were kind of the evocation of a society that had grown around chivalry. The church very much wanted to be in charge of power, and violence is a strong part of that. And so a lot of the restrictions, but also the sort of the burnishing of chivalry came from the church, right? So it's a way to elevate yourself from just being a common thug, a common soldier, and to be part of this godly endeavor. But also, Catholicism went through every aspect of life and society. And so it was hard to talk about lordship without talking about Catholicism. It's hard to talk about what did it mean to be a peasant. It's just, you cannot think about medieval society in Europe and not think about Catholicism.
Hi, Jamie, this is Odette. I know you and I were talking about this a couple days ago, but I mean, ultimately, in a lot of ways, these knightly virtues are kind of the brakes that the church put on the people who had the power to overthrow basically their own kind of fiefdom and their temporal power. What do you think about that?
Sure. So I think it's a mixed bag, like it always is, right? So some of this is aspirational. I like to talk about if we were to give a set of virtues for soldiers in the modern era, we would all roughly agree on what that meant, right? But at the same time, the conflating it with actual enforceable rules, such as the peace of God and the truce of God, is very much a top-down, I wouldn't call it a power grab, but an attempt to have some sway on the people who had the real physical power. And I mentioned it briefly in the video, but it's very interesting to me to read how many times the Pope had to say, no, really, guys, you can't just kill whoever gets in your way. Or to hear, especially in times like the 100 Years' War, hear stories about just how wild and uncontrollable a group of young men with swords could be. I mean, it's anarchy in the purest of sense.
What was the virtue that impacted you most within your career in the SCA?
I think it's an interesting question. I would say that exploring what courage means was probably the most powerful for me. That switch between courage being physical courage, because again, we're not risking much once we get to a certain level of skill, right? Like your typical unbelted champion isn't worried about getting hurt, But the courage to speak up when there's been a wrong, the courage to do important things, things that are difficult, but that are public, right? In my own career, it was definitely stepping outside of my comfort zone, for instance, to be Baron of Barony. Normally a very quiet, private person, and that was a very public position. But it was really powerful for me to grow, and I felt like it was a very good service to give to my group. And that's just one example of several where this path for me has meant a lot of personal growth that's taken courage beyond just stepping onto the field, stepping into the list.
How, as a more private person, do you go about exhibiting franchise, and what does that mean to you?
Excellent question. I feel like I've grown into that. Partly it's that I'm now a very different person when I'm have the belt on, when I'm in armor. I feel more confident and powerful in that realm, and so then I feel more comfortable talking to people than, say, if I was sitting in a coffee shop. And part of that's just life, right? You get to be more comfortable in things that you're good at and things that you know about, things that you're expert in. But I've also absolutely made a conscious effort to be more outgoing, to engage people in things like this. This is not something that I perhaps would have done. I absolutely wouldn't do this. And if you follow me on Facebook, I comment maybe 4 times a year. But I do have these skills. I do enjoy teaching. I do like interacting with people that share my values and skill sets, and having seen people benefit from it helps too.
Jamie, this is Odette again. Back to the Frenchies. Is it more external, internal? Because I think in a lot of ways, when you look at it, it's the expectation of nobility in others and not just your display of ability, but being able to see and appreciate another person's nobility. Is that not how you see it?
So if you want to start an argument, ask a group of knights about franchises. I've heard several times people say we should stop using the phrase altogether because none of us can agree on what it means. Personally,
How medieval.
Yeah, right. My own personal definition of it is essentially how well do you do the job of the knight? And so part of that, I would say, is can you recognize that in others and can you evoke that in others? But a lot of that's personal. So I've got a question from Roberto. Roberto, could you rephrase that for me?
Hi, Jamie. Yeah, I can rephrase that. So I asked the question earlier when we were talking about knighthood more in the actual medieval sense, and it seems to me that sometimes knighthood kind of was used not only as a way to control very violent people, but also to establish some sort of like Catholic philosophical cosmic order where God is the creator, Jesus is the son, and then the church, and then after that comes the noble chivalric orders, and it's kind of like this hierarchy that's sort of ordered cosmology. I kind of wanted to throw that out there and get your thoughts on that, if that makes sense.
Sure, it does make sense. And again, it's part of that whole, you can't understand how society was structured or the philosophy without understanding Catholic philosophy. And I would say that that may have been sort of ad hoc. So I think that having control over violence is definitely has to be part of that cosmology, right? Like you have to somehow deal with the problem of killing people when you have a religion that says you should be peaceful all the time. And so putting that into the cosmology somewhere is a necessity, but also a tool. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much.
So looking back at this video, which I made 2 years ago, I've realized that I haven't really stuck with those 8 virtues. In fact, if you'd asked me this morning before I rewatched that video, you know, what 7 virtues would you pick? I might kind of be at a loss. So were there any virtues that I didn't go over that people have that would be interesting to talk about? Oh, and we have another question too. The question is, coming at this from a late 15th century persona, do you know of a period source discussing knightly virtue post 100 Years' War? That's not my period, but their Order of the Odette, what was it? Order of the Golden Fleece.
Golden Fleece, Duke
Yes.
of Burgundy.
Is a later period, and there were several knightly orders that existed post 100 Years' War that had their own lists, but that's one that has a pretty good codified sort of thesis statement.
And 12 specified virtues.
All right, so here's a good one. I don't include humility in my list of virtues, and I think that's in large part due to how we think about humility and how they would have thought about humility. So what do you all think about including humility as a knightly virtue?
Personally, I would include humility as a knightly virtue, but that's my focus on my persona because I'm trying to do with a Spanish thing. And Ramon Llull, when he wrote in the late 13th century, he specifically wrote about humility. So I'm trying to sort of incorporate that in my persona portrayal as well as think about how that reflects in my life as well. Though I definitely agree that the contemporary discussions of humility are vastly different from the medieval conversation of humility.
So how does your source talk about it?
So my source talks about it as a, how do I say this? It's keeping an awareness of one's station and keeping an awareness of one's fidelity, not only in the political sense, in terms of, you know, fealty to your liege lord, but also fealty to your spiritual commitment to God. Be a good, devout Catholic in this respect, but also keep one's head, to use a metaphor, keep one's head from getting too high up. Keeping a sort of earthly focus in terms of your political commitments, but also keeping a sort of present focus and constant attention to your spiritual requirements. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I would agree. The period sources the talk of humility, it's very much a theological virtue, you know, very much a these gifts that I have, these things that I can do aren't me, they're given to me from God, and keeping that in mind. So we've got quite a few people here who I know have studied the virtues pretty extensively. Anybody else have anything interesting that's come up when they've learned about historical virtues versus modern virtues?
Yeah, hi, my name's Raphael. I have a philosophy degree. So you have, right, like Aristotelian virtue ethics is like kind of the norm until the late 18th century, which at a certain point you start getting, you have John Stuart Mill in utilitarian school, and then Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics start presenting themselves as like valid alternative ethical theories to relying on these like list of virtues. With like utilitarianism like being like the most straightforward, and deontology having, like Robert Nozick eventually talks to us about these like deontological side constraints. You can't violate people like these kinds of rights people have, all of which like both the deontological side constraints and the virtue ethics both present the problem of you have a list of things that you want to be doing, and sometimes a situation is going to call for you to pick one or the other one.
Right, so that's kind of a comparison between the historical challenges of being virtuous, right, and the modern challenges. Also, shout out to philosophy degree holders. Yeah, and I would say that any ethical system that you study that seems easy probably isn't the one to go with. All right, another question. What virtue do you all find the hardest to keep up with?
It wasn't one that you mentioned here, but that's one that shows up in a lot of lists. And I think that temperance is usually the hardest virtue because it's a little bit of all of them. And if you have an excess of any virtue except for temperance, that's usually good. But if you have too much temperance, you're not temperate.
Well, that's very Aristotelian of you. Aristotle would say that's true of all the virtues, but yeah, he was a fan of temperance. So temperance is very much like what I termed franchise. It's, can you do the right thing in the right way at the right time to the right degree?
Here's a question: judged by who?
So Aristotle would say judged by you and the situation and how it turns out. The Aquinas would say judged by God. I would say take all of that into account, right? Like if you're talking about franchise, it's can be evident in its situational effect. So if you feel good about yourself, you feel like you're being knightly and you're being looked down upon, or it's not being received well, that's information that you need because you may not get it right.
So the modern day knights in a society judge it.
Yes, I would say that that your chivalric circle is an excellent resource for that. That sometimes the unwashed masses, if you will, may not understand, and you may still be exhibiting virtue, but those who study it, those who live it, can be an excellent mirror. Eleanor is mocking me for using unwashed masses.
She definitely had the head shake going there.
What virtue do you find the hardest to embody?
Excellent question. I don't know. I'm pretty good at this. So probably humility. Maybe that's why I don't include it. I don't know. In the past few weeks, prowess, but I don't know if that's fair to say.
We've all been struggling there.
Yeah, I think you nail it on humility. So I'm glad you didn't include it. And I think on that point, it becomes more and more difficult as we live longer and longer in that space of judging oneself to a guideline that is set by a group of people, or when I say group of people, I'm not just talking knights, but I'm talking to society in general, especially when we add the modern day aspects to it.
Well, and I think that that's true of historic knights as well, right? So that arrogance definitely was a danger, but being full of yourself was absolutely expected and encouraged.
I would agree 100%.
I have a question for you, Jamie.
Mm-hmm.
How would you recommend somebody go about developing or fostering a virtue within themselves?
Ooh, excellent question. I would say that meditating on it in the same way that you would a martial skill that you can't practice. So we've all got some practice with that right now. And by that, I mean focusing your attentions deliberately, right? So like if you're working on, let's say, honesty, loyalty, for an example, bringing yourself back to that daily and seeing how well you're doing, studying on it, thinking on it, and giving yourself sort of a grade on that can be very helpful. Also, again, talking to people who you find excel at that. We all know people who we wish we could be, who we wish could emulate better. And so studying that person and what makes them tick can be really, really helpful.
Jamie, would you say mindfulness is part of that then?
I would, especially in the sense of the self-evaluation. I think it's a trap that you can fall into, that you feel like you exhibit or, embody some of these virtues when perhaps you really don't. And that's a practice itself that you have to do over and over again, that self-reflection, but also that checking in with others and with the impact you're actually having.
So here's one that we all struggle with, right? And I'll specifically, I'm sure everybody does, but specifically the order. How do we, the reverse of that, when we can never live to it?
Well, that's the whole thing, right? It's striving for perfection, knowing that you'll never reach it. I would say that's an issue with any kind of virtue ethic or ethic in general. And I think that were I to include humility, that would be part of it, right? Is knowing that we're never going to be the perfect knight, the perfect person. And I would say, in part, that's in the franchises, the way I would talk about it, that knowing that you're flawed is part of living in the world in a real way.
We're talking about knightly virtues, but which of these virtues do you think should apply to some of the other peerages? All, or are there any that would not apply, or additional ones that you think should be in there?
Well, so since they don't end up being particularly knightly, I think you could apply them all across the board. You'd have to do a little bit of translation, but if you take prowess as skill, I think it's pretty easy to apply those to not just peerages, but people in general. There's a reason that these lists existed for hundreds of years and people still talk about them as important. So Odette sent me a question. Do you mean modern or historical chivalry?
I think in the case of if we're talking here about chivalric in the, let's say, high Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages to high Middle Ages, what exactly, if you were going to say, what is the perfect, with the eidos, what is the perfect form, what if you saw it and said that is chivalry and nothing else, and it can be nothing but chivalry, what would that be?
I would say protecting populations. So the knighthood took a lot of resources, and mostly it was essentially a protection racket, right? So if you aren't able to do your job and protect your people, then you're not being knightly. And in fact, the French chivalry got in trouble for this during the 100 Years' War, because they took a lot of money and status and weren't able to stop the English from taking a lot of territory. But that also led to a French revival in chivalry and martial culture.
All right, and since we're on that, what would you say that is the eidos of chivalry in the SCA is?
That is a much harder question. I would say to protect the martial culture and to foster honor in that culture. Because again, we're not dealing with life and death here.
What do you think is the most important knightly virtue?
That depends on the day. But I would say that likely loyalty. Again, because we are sort of the protectors of this subculture that we live in, this martial subculture, keeping that foremost in your mind and keeping your connections to the people foremost in your mind is the most important. So I got a text question. If you'll never reach perfection, what makes you continue to strive to reach it in each virtue? And I would say that that is the fun of it, right? I often think about my my days in my youth of playing video games and learning that there are cheat codes where I can just waltz through without challenge, and how unsatisfying that ends up being. So you can get a perfect score, but once you've perfected that, then you're done, right? If it's challenging, if you can never reach perfection, then that's where growth happens. That's where life happens. And that's what really draws me to this sport and the study of chivalry in general, is that growth, that deep commitment. And again, if you could perfect it, then you could stop. Any more questions?
Can we build on what you were just talking about, Jamie? If we're looking at like the motivations, people's personal motivations, and mastery is one, you know, it's like autonomy, mastery, and purpose are the drivers of people's ultimate, you know, their ultimate drivers after, you know, necessities are covered. Are we saying then that the strive for things that we can never reach is kind of our own reaching for mastery and our quest to master those virtues?
Is that to say that that this is a natural impulse?
Yeah, it is. It's a driver and a motor. It's a human motivator to say that what you want to be able to be in charge of your own life, to get better, no matter what you're doing, you want to get better at it, and then you have to have a purpose for that, you know, and your life should have purpose.
Yeah, I mean, to expound on that a little bit, I do think it's natural to strive for perfection, and I think to Branos's point, it's also natural to react when you don't reach perfection, right? And that's the challenge for all of us, for all tasks. Servidus, who trained me, talked a lot about the mountain, right? So especially for prowess, when you're working your way up to the top of the mountain, you always have to keep in mind that there's a side that you're going to be climbing down where things don't go as well for you. And one of the cool things about ethics is that doesn't have to be true, that you can keep getting better and closer to that perfection, whatever that means.
Do you find that the knightly virtues have an impact on your life outside of the SCA, and if so, how?
I would say that I was already a fairly Boy Scouty person anyway, but it has really helped with my being able to talk to people about these things. I don't have children, but I do work with children in my day-to-day life, and so sometimes being able to have a terminology to go to talk to them is very helpful. In my day-to-day, I was already pretty virtuous and fairly cognizant of it. I also have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, so this is something I've thought a lot about in a lot of levels. Anybody else have any questions?
Would you say that virtues are something more experienced personally or shared?
I would say it's definitely shared. I would say that, I mean, again, to get philosophical, were I alone in the cosmos, I don't think virtues would exist, right? It's definitely an interpersonal relationship, but also um, having it be virtuous as in something of value, the value is to the community as well as personal. Does that make sense? So it's both um, of personal worth, but it's definitely a community experience, right? So like, again, if I'm a hermit, not interacting with anybody, I can be loyal, I can be brave. It doesn't impact the world or other people. That really is in our relationships, these things even come up. So we have 10 more scheduled minutes for this meeting. If we have any more questions or discussions.
I was going to ask you, unfortunately, I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I think they used to do a nightly discussion which was open to everyone, at Penzic. Finvar used to run them years and years ago. I ran one probably 20 years ago. I thought something like this would be another opportunity if we happen to have Penzic this year. I think it would be a wonderful thing for maybe you to put together something. Last time we did this was in Mid-Realm Royal, and it was very well attended. We had entertainers come in and sing songs about the virtues, and then people were sitting and asking questions right there. And it was kind of not so much fireside because we were under the kind of the 40 by 40, but it was I thought a very good chance to have people that all had that interest in common.
Yeah, be
Quite often, Callantyr, Count Fernando, and Count Simyaka will hold one night at Penzic.
So if it is the case and you want to do something like that, be more than happy to work with you about it. I had actually done up cards and pre-asked questions, chivalric questions, so that and actually I asked online some questions, and I took those questions and put it on the card for people to think about prior to getting there, so we had deeper subject matter to go through. And it was very everybody enjoyed it quite a bit. So I'd be happy to work with you if you're interested.
Very, very interested.
Thank you for putting this on, by the way, as well.
Hey, very welcome. And I'll mute.
Hi, I have a question. I've been trying to sit here thinking of how best to phrase this, actually. How, in the modern Middle Ages, do you guys as an order help use these to help you kind of decide who gets into your order? Is that like kind of, is there a way in which you guys kind of frame these or to help you make decisions? I don't know if that's like too close to home with like giving out secrets. That's why I was like, how do I best phrase this before I say what I'm gonna say?
So I'm terribly sorry. I had muted my speaker accidentally. Could you tell me the first part of that question again?
That's okay. No. So my question is, as an order, how do you guys use these lords and ladies, because there's both in the order? How do you use these virtues? Do you use them as like a guideline when you're making decisions on who gets into the order and like what's the best way? I didn't want to ask. I was trying to figure out how to ask you this because I was like, I don't know if this is going too deep and you're not allowed to say. So I was just like, oh, I'm curious.
No, not at all. They end up being shorthand a lot of times. So clearly we're looking at a lot of different people. A lot of times it'll be people that we don't know well because, you know, we have a fairly wide swath. And so oftentimes you get anecdotes and they'll be phrased as, here's an excellent example of this virtue by this person, so that we don't have to necessarily take the meaning and squeeze it out for every person on the list. And it's in our cultural consciousness all the time, I think. And so even if we're not specifically saying, you know, this person exhibits this person's lacking in that, it definitely informs, I would say, almost all of our conversations.
And can I add something to that? I would say don't ever be afraid to ask any order how they judge people. We can't say names, but we sure can tell you each and every individual person what they look for, because it's a group of people that are looking. You know, it's as a group we don't all think one way. I go into that meeting. Jamie might have a much better fight with an individual than I do, but that doesn't mean his prowess is poor. Right? To me, sometimes I look at that fight that Jamie had with him and say, hey, this guy is good. Even though maybe he's not so much with me, he has to meet a bar. And you know, sometimes when, depending where you are, you have to look and say, I can't judge people. In fact, I have personally had to struggle with this myself. In fact, when I was Prince, I had somebody come to me and say, after a meeting, say, I just want to let you know that you are no longer the bar, because that's how I was judging people. And that was wrong, right? So we learn, and it's how we have to learn. And, but, you know, I think asking these questions right here demystifies the orders and the way that people think about them, because these are everybody's orders. They're not just ours. They're yours too. And we want these to be your orders. We want to serve you guys. We want to be there as examples. We want to be there when you need something. We want to be your champion. And I'm not just talking chivalry. I am talking the Pelicans and the Laurels and the Mods and all the orders like this, the Royal Peers. Everybody wants to be there, each one of those people. So asking questions like this, I think, are really, really important. So thank you.
It is. And I would say, to bring it into this conversation, beyond just prowess, there's a bar for all the virtues. You know, again, we don't expect perfection, and where that bar is changes from person to person, right? So again, my bar for loyalty may be a little lower than Branos's bar for loyalty. And that's complicated again by, this is a hobby and not real life, in air quotes. And so sometimes you have to say, okay, were we judging a historical knighthood, this is where the bar would be, but we can't expect that of people that have 9-to-5 jobs and families. And so it's okay for it to be here. All right, if there are no more questions or comments, thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed yourself. On the Facebook for the link to the video or the pickups.